Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Holly Borham, Associate Curator for Prints and Drawings at the Blanton Museum of Art. Welcome to our series, Curated Conversations. Tonight's topic is What's the Deal? A Print Collecting Primer, Part 2, featuring selections from our brand new exhibition that just opened this weekend, After Michelangelo, Past Picasso, Leo Steinberg's Library of Prints. This exhibition is on view through early May. I am joined today by special guests whom I'll now ask to say hello so that their faces pop up on the screen.
Hello, I'm Susan.
Hello, I'm Carolyn.
Welcome. Before we start, just a few notes. Your audio is muted, so no one can hear you, and only the panelists are visible on the screen. We'll be taking your questions in the Q&A window. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a series of icons, including one listed labeled Q&A. So click on that to type and send your questions, which we will look forward to answering. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. I'll tell you a little bit more about our panelists here. Carolyn and Susan have had a professional partnership as print dealers since 1989. Carolyn is based in Dallas, Texas, and was previously the art gallery director at Zeitlin and Verbrugge booksellers in Los Angeles, California, and director of the Old Master Print Department at Hom Gallery in Washington, D.C. Susan Schulman has been a dealer also in museum print, quality fine prints for many years. She serves on the visiting committee for prints and drawings at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York and the Wallet Committee at the New York Public Library. Carolyn and Susan have done great service to the field of print scholarship as founding members, founding patrons, I should say, of the Association of Print Scholars, and are partners in the Schulman and Bullard Article Prize awarded by the Association of Print Scholars. So tonight, I'm gonna start by kind of talking some broad overview about printmaking, and then we'll get into sort of the expertise and details of impression quality and values and those sort of things with our print dealers here. So a couple weeks ago, I hope some of you were able to join us, and if not, you can find this previous curated conversation archived on our website. We spoke with two contemporary printmakers about their practice, and we got tips on collecting contemporary prints. Today, we'll be talking about how to collect prints that are made by artists who are no longer living. You can't go and ask them, did you make this? Does it represent your original intention, or has it been altered in some way? And in fact, tonight, we're generally going to focus on prints made before about 1800 or techniques that were prevalent before that date. So we'll start with the really broad question of what is an original print? Because this can be kind of a confusing thing. I'm going to start screen sharing and take a look at a PowerPoint here. All right, so what is an original print? It's in some ways, this is kind of a difficult question, but we're gonna go back and sort of start with the earliest printmaking and start with that as our starting point. So when you make a print, you start with what's called a matrix. And a matrix could be a block of wood, it could be a metal plate, it could be a potato. But you start with something that you carve or enter a design on. In this case, on the left side of your screen, we're looking at a wood block that has a design on it by the very famous German Renaissance artist, Albrecht Dürer. And what Dürer did was he drew his design on the block, and then he had it carved into the block. And it's kind of easier to understand what happens if you look at the print on the right that was pulled from the block. Everywhere where you see a white area, that is where the block was carved away, and all of the raised, or all the black area, all the lines you see are the area that's raised on the block. So after that block was carved, then it was inked and printed, meaning you put a piece of paper on it, ran it through a press, and the resulting print is called an impression. Now, the artist can ink and print that many, many times, and each time that you make an impression, that's an original work of art. So each of those is an original, and that's how printmaking is we talk about it as multiple originals. Now, Over time, that block might degrade a little bit and there gets to be some cracks in it. And maybe the block gets sold. And over time, it sort of might change a little bit depending on what somebody does to it. But each time that block is used and it's inked and printed, that's considered an original. Now, Susan and Carolyn will give us some insights into what might make it a better or a worse impression, but we'll save that for a little bit later. That's our first type of matrix. Those are called relief prints. Another type of matrix that is also used in historical printmaking methods is a copper plate. And these, there are sort of two main types of prints that are pulled from copper plates. And in general, these are called intaglio prints. The first type is an engraving. So you start with a metal plate and you use a sharp metal tool and you incise lines. You're basically carving lines into your metal plate. The other way that you can get lines into a metal plate is by covering the plate with a waxy ground, sort of, just imagine sort of a layer that resists acid. And then you use a etching needle and you draw your design into that wax. So you're not carving lines into a metal plate with a burr and a sharp tool, you're drawing in wax. And then you put that plate into acid, and the acid does the hard work of etching those lines down into the plate. Then, whether you've engraved the lines or etched the lines, you apply the ink to the plate, you rub it really carefully to get the ink down into those lines, and you wipe it smooth so that the surface is clean. And then you, again, put the piece of paper on the plate, run it through a printing press, and each time it goes through, each piece of paper you put on there is an original work of art. As you can imagine, over time, some of those lines degrade, they don't hold ink as well, they wear out. And again, Carolyn and Susan can walk us through what makes a stronger or a weaker impression. But here we can see an example of the plate that Rembrandt, in this case, etched on the left, and the print that was pulled from that plate on the right. After intaglio prints, there are many other types of prints that develop, printmaking techniques that develop, such as lithography and screen printing, the addition of photographic elements, but we're not, for the sake of time today, we're going to mainly be focusing on the unique characteristics to look out for in relief prints and intaglio prints. Now, how do you know if you are looking at an original print or versus sort of a facsimile, a photograph of an original print perhaps, or something that's in a museum gift shop? There's a couple clues, and all of these can get very complicated and fascinating, but just a couple things to consider when you're looking at old prints is what kind of paper they're printed on. The first, so the original types of paper, as you can see here on the left, is what's called laid paper. So paper actually used to be made out of rags and mixed up in this kind of stew of water and rags that you would heat up and mush together and then pour onto a mold, which is what you see there on the top left of your screen. And the mold is kind of in a grid-shaped pattern. This is also where you would get watermarks, where you could make little designs in the wire there, so that when you hold this paper up to the light, like you see on the bottom left, you see these faint horizontal and vertical lines, and you might even see some patterns in there if there's a watermark. In the mid-1750s, a different type of paper was developed. This is called wove paper, where that sort of the paper stew, essentially, that you would pour onto the mold is poured more onto a mesh screen. And if you hold that paper up to the light, it's a much more uniform appearance. So paper is one kind of clue you can look at when you're trying to figure out if a print is old or not, or original or not. The other thing is there's going to be a little bit of a texture to prints. If you think about that metal plate that's getting impressed against a piece of paper and going through a press, there's going to be a little bit of a ridge line at the edge of that plate. I'm showing you a print from our new exhibition that's up on display, and you can see here around the edges just a hint of the outline of the original plate mark there. So now somebody over time might have cut away those edges, so you can't always say that the absence of a plate mark means it's not an original print, but for intaglio prints, you want to see, is there a plate mark? And even for woodblock prints, there's going to be a little bit of a texture to the paper because the paper has been pressed against essentially a sculpted piece of wood. Towards the end of the 19th century, artists started signing and editioning their works. This is a beautiful Picasso that's in our exhibition. You can see on the bottom left there that Picasso's added the edition number. This is number 66 out of 180 that were printed, and he's signed this work there on the right. So the earliest prints aren't going to be editioned, but this is a clue that for a later work of art that this is part of a limited number of prints that were made. And then just to kind of point out another caution here, this work that I found here on the right is from 1000museums.com. And if you look at it, it looks pretty similar, and it's missing that edition number. And it's absolutely fine to buy a work of art from 1000museums.com, but you just want to know what you're buying. And if you found the one on the right at a yard sale and it was framed and you got all excited thinking that maybe you'd found this original Picasso, you'd want to step back and maybe look at other museum collections and see, well, is it supposed to be editioned? And should I unframe it and look to see, is there a plate mark? Those are all kinds of things that you'd want to consider before shouting from the rooftops that you found a new original Picasso. So that's just really quick sort of pointers and understanding background about what makes a print or an original work of art. But as I've mentioned a few times, not all originals are the same quality. And so now we're going to turn to Susan and Carolyn to help us look carefully at two works that are in the Blanton's collection, both by Rembrandt. And I'd like Susan and Carolyn, if you could step in here and help us see the differences between these two impressions.
Carolyn, shall I launch in?
Sure.
First of all, it's fantastic to have The Descent from the Cross by Torchlight is one of my favorite Rembrandt prints. And to have two impressions is just absolutely fantastic. The one on the right is Rembrandt cared so much about printmaking. And I'm not sure if everyone who's participating has looked at prints before, but there have been many artists, and Rembrandt was one of the great ones in the 17th century, who are still renowned for their painting, who devoted an incredible amount of energy and time during their lengthy careers to making prints. Rembrandt had his own press, and he was very, very happy to keep changing the plates and getting different effects of time and time of day, and different effects of emotion. So the one on the right, it's nocturnal and it's mournful, and Christ is, being removed from the cross, and it's just dark and devastating. The impression on the right, without seeing it, becomes something that you have to do some research on. You can see, I think, in the background up above that the plate's starting to wear a little bit. It's getting a little gray. It's partly that it's more cleanly wiped in its inking, but it also may be that the plate is just starting to deteriorate a little bit. And also suggesting that is when you see these kind of very black velvety passages on the right, those are created by using a tool called by creating burr, by scoring the plate, throwing up little ridges of metal, which then hold the ink and create a very velvety line and effect. That wears very quickly, 10, 20 impressions, and that can just be gone. So you see a plate that no longer has a velvety feeling. You do see certain passages revealed more clearly than you do when it's heavily inked. Rembrandt's plates were printed by other people. I don't remember offhand about this particular print, whether they're posthumous impressions, but the one on the right, just blink response, that is a beautiful lifetime impression. We know that is exactly how Rembrandt wanted this print to look. The one on the left, Holly, I don't know, do you know, is that a lifetime printing? Do you happen to know offhand?
I don't know. I'm suspecting not, but I haven't looked into it. Yeah. Good question.
So I also would interject, Susan, that the impression that's on the right, as you can see by what Holly's typed on the bottom, is on Japanese paper. And that was a very special kind of paper that Rembrandt printed on. He liked it. And it makes for impressions where the ink almost slides on the surface of the sheet. So it has lots and lots of dry point on it, but that's enhanced by the slickness of the Japanese paper that contributes to that rich and velvety look. And one of the things I think that distinguishes a later impression, such as the one on the left, is that the volumes and the figures, the three-dimensionality of the figures tends to flatten out, and you don't get a good recession into space the way you do on the right, even though on the right, in the dark area below the architecture on the right, it's quite heavily inked. Nevertheless, as Susan pointed out, probably the impression on the left is coming from a plate which is already showing quite a bit of wear, and it's not holding as much ink as an earlier impression would. So to look at, when you're trying to evaluate early versus later impression, if you have a flattening out of the forms, if you have a flattening out of the volumes, that can be an indication perhaps that there's been wear to the plate and that it's not as early as it should be.
So we have a question here about what is a lifetime print or lifetime impression. So could you tell us that? And then does it matter?
So it matters enormously, because with old master prints, the thing that we really most look for is, does this particular impression that I'm looking at on the wall or holding in my hands, even because prints are wonderful that way, you can actually hold it in its mat right up close to your nearsighted eyes in our case. And really enjoy it at close range. Sorry, I just distracted myself digressing.
Yes, it matters. Lifetime means
Yes.
impression.
Yes, yes.
During the artist's lifetime, either by him or her or by a designated printer that worked on behalf of the artist. But it means it was printed while the artist was living. We have incredible documentation on Rembrandt's printing. Eric Hinterding, who's an art historian and curator at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, spent over a decade accumulating the watermarks that Holly mentioned briefly earlier. And by studying the degradation of the plate and matching it with the papers that Rembrandt used, Eric was able to establish for us, Rembrandt first printed this in 1630. And with this X watermark, and then 10 years later, we see a bunch of other impressions, all with similar wear with a different watermark. So we can really pinpoint exactly when he printed them. Early, rich impressions like the one on the right are enormously valuable. I think we're not supposed to talk specifics, but we're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars. As soon as they start to move in the direction of the one on the left, they're worth a fraction of that. And when you get into impressions that were pulled in the 19th century, or some that were, because many of the plates survived into the 20th century, when you're talking about the ones that these millennial impressions, which some of you may have heard of, ones that were printed in the latter half of the 20th century, really, to me, they have less value than a good photograph of a fine early impression. They're sold as kind of pieces of the true cross, from an original Rembrandt plate, but the plate is degraded and no longer can produce an impression such as the one on the right. And it no longer has the same aesthetic value. And even if it's in 6 silk mats and a great big gilded frame in a Rodeo Drive art gallery, it doesn't have any true value.
Is darker, so we're talking with Rembrandt here, talking about how darker areas, like I'm seeing lots of this dry point here in the back of this man's jacket, those nice velvety parts here that are missing over there.
And also, if you look down, Holly, on the stretcher, those little short black strokes were caused by the burr from the dry point, which are lacking, of course, over here on the left-hand side of the impression.
Yeah.
You see quite a bit of wear there. Actually, and one thing we should also say is that Rembrandt, we think he may have printed several hundred impressions from any of his plates during his lifetime. The survival rate is tiny compared to that fact. With the Samson rending the lion, the wonderful woodcut that you showed as your first pair, if you look at the woodblock on the left, you could probably, many of you noticed this, you could see that the edges were quite broken in the border lines. There were big chunks missing. And that's because it was printed under heavy pressure. And with those wood blocks, they may have printed thousands of impressions from those wood blocks during Durer's lifetime. He wanted to get as many impressions as he could and sell them, all over the world if he could.
Well into the next century, those wood blocks were printed from it. So.
And that wood block's at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I think the impression that you showed, Holly, I think that's also from the Met, I believe.
Yes.
Because it's a stunning impression. And that impression shows what Durer would have been looking at when he, in the very first groups that he would have printed. And again, that is an immensely valuable impression of that print.
There's a question here just about the size of these prints. I don't have those dimensions on the slide here, but
well, this one is, the Rembrandt is probably just a bit smaller than a piece of typing paper. Right. And the Samson is probably about 1.5 feet by, about 20 inches, I would say, by 14 inches, something like that.
Great. So we're looking for, are we always looking for something that's darker than something that's lighter? How do you know if what the artist's intention was, I guess?
Well, one way to ascertain that is there's a vast amount of literature on Rembrandt's prints, and look at them. They will vary in quality as to just how accurate any given photograph is. But as Carolyn says, once you know that there's supposed to be dry point in it, well, you can see it on the right, you don't see it on the left. You can go into your local museum, and if they have an impression, make an appointment to see that impression. And the curator will probably be able to sit down with you and with reference books and determine, our impression looks amazing. Our impression looks like it's showing somewhere. Our impression looks like it was printed the day before yesterday, which is not a good thing with all master prints. And you just have to start educating your eye. Sometimes artists such as Gaucius in the 16th century actually deliberately used less black material in their inks to print a more gray silvery line. So we're not always looking for black. With Durer, you are. I mean, that was a very important thing in German printmaking of that period, to have this very dark, rich ink. But that's not necessarily, that doesn't necessarily continue. And
Susan, I just want to interrupt for a second, just say also, when you're looking at Durer, you really want to see a clarity of line. Because what happens is when the press keeps pressing down on the wood blocks, over time, the lines flatten and actually widen a bit. So if you look at this stunning impression, you can see that each line, no matter how fine it is printing very clearly, very sharply, and one can read it very clearly. So that is another good marker to look for when you look at Durer woodcuts, for example. You want to see a clarity of line, and you want to see all of the lines printing evenly as possible.
Crisply. And you want the borderline to be present. You should really think twice about a Durer woodcut that is cut within the borderline, because there's a very important reference work called Mater, which records the degradations to the wood blocks through time for Durer's prints, again, helping us to determine what's lifetime, what's later. And one thing that he describes are breaks in the borderline. So they're quite important. And you also want to be able to look at the print in a raking light and see if it's been touched in with pen and ink, because that often is done to make the print look a bit earlier. But as Carolyn says, if you can look at the print and the lines are they're crisp and they're distinct, and you see all the amazing detail, this is such an wonderful, extraordinary woodcut, then you're looking at something early. If it looks black and clogged and the lines, you're not sure, the lion looks a little weird, you're looking at an impression that was taken at a later time. But they were meant to be printed in the many thousands. They were meant to be a mass market product, really. but in the 21st century, we often want the early ones.
So I think, Holly, you actually have a Goltzius pair coming up. So maybe
Goltzius pair coming up. So there, we do have a question about the type of presses that are used. If it's different from a woodblock versus.
Yes, the woodblocks are printed from a press, or that's like a printing press. It was pressure coming from up above down, and the copper plates were in a rolling press. So yes, they were different.
Okay, so now that we've talked with Carolyn and Susan a little bit about what to be looking for, I thought we could go kind of do some window shopping together. These days, many of the in-person art fairs are now online. And so this West Coast Print Fair it's normally held in Portland every year, and it's online now. And they're actually, it's closing tonight. It does say we're live through February 8th, but in fact, they kept it open one more night for us because I asked if they would, since we're gonna have a group of interested print people learning about prints tonight. So this is just a screenshot, but you can see, for example, if you go to one of these print fairs, they're divided up into different categories. We are going tonight to focus on this category here, the Old Master prints and drawings. I pulled out a few examples just to show you a range of prices here. Sometimes we think older means more expensive, and that's not always the case. There's a range of these works, and we're going to take a look, as Carolyn has foreshadowed for us, at a Gaucius print. And so just to show, this is what you look, so when you go to this West Coast Print Fair, you can look at different dealers' sort of virtual shops. And I pulled this one out because the Blanton has an impression of this same print, and it's by a premier 16th century printmaker, Hendrick Galcius. It's a fabulous, crazy image of these intertwined bodies, this decapitated, the decapitated head down here, this man who's about to be devoured by a dragon. And then over here, art dealers give you relevant information. So, you can see who the artist is, the fact that this is an engraving. It says that it's signed and dated in the plate. Carolyn and Susan can talk to us more about that in a minute. It mentions a watermark, so there's something there about the paper, the literature. A discussion of the impression quality and the condition. So what life has this lived since it left the printing press? And then it says that it's rare and highly sought after. All of those things indicate high price, probably. So I'm going to let Carolyn and Susan talk us through the comparison between the work that's in our collection on the top and then the one on the bottom.
Well, you have a stellar impression in the Blanton collection. And, in a certain way, Carol, speaking about wanting impressions that reflect the artist's intentions, that is Carolyn's and my bias, because we really sell largely to museums and to very super specialized collectors. That's what we're always seeking. But Leo Steinberg was an absolutely fascinating collector. And Carolyn and I actually did the appraisal for his collection when it was purchased by the Blanton many years ago. He was a scholar and an academic. And in the 1960s, he was given a prize, I think of $500, I forget if it was $500 or $1,000, but that was actually a nice chunk of change at the time. And he was going over to London to do some research. And he walked into Carnegie and bought 500 prints for that money, basically. And some of them, many of them were on album sheets from the Princes of Liechtenstein. Some of them were fabulous impressions, and some were really ghosts. He wanted them for their art historical content. He had begun a collection of images literally when he was a child. He had filing cases full of images because Leo could not sit down at a computer and call up material from around the world. So he really wanted to have his own museum of images. And this was for his intellectual work as an art historian. In this instance, Leo bought a superb impression. And I don't think it came from that first group. I think this was something that he probably paid up for. You see how brilliantly three-dimensional it is. It's so gruesome, but you feel the action of the subject. You're in the middle of Cadmus having his face chewed off. The effect of light on his body and also on the beast body is fantastic. And the impression below with Vischer's, you see Vischer's address.
See, Holly is circled.
Bottom right.
In red, Holly is circled where the address is down there, and it's lacking in the one from the Blanton because actually it was printed before the publisher's name went on the second state.
It was printed by Gaucius himself.
Right. And when it says state 1 of 4, state, you want to explain what states are, Holly, to your audience?
Sure. So state, the first state is whatever the artist did first and then prints it. And then if they go back and they add anything, they make any changes to the actual plate, that's a second state. So you could print, we don't always know how many were printed in each state, but if you notice a change in the plate, so in this case, something was engraved down here, that's at least the second state. And then we know, because there are print scholars who have chased down all the different impressions, that there are 4 states. So there's 2 other changes that have been made to this plate over time.
And in the case of old master prints, it's frequently not so much a change in the image, but rather publishers' names that change. So in this case, Gaucius's name, Gaucius publishes the first state. In this second state at the print fair, it's passed into the hands of a print publisher who printed during Gaucius's lifetime, but he also printed after Gaucius's lifetime. So we don't know for sure whether this was printed before Gaucius's death or after.
Yeah, a good place to look is the upper right-hand corner above the human figure, because you can see in the sky, you can no longer really read the clouds any longer. So there's quite a bit of wear there, and it may have just been that it was printed so many times during Gaucius's lifetime, and then Vischer printed hundreds.
And then it went on to 2 subsequent publishers after that into the 18th century. It was a very popular print. But if you look at the impression on the bottom, a passage that jumps out at me is on the left, where the bodies of the snakes are entwined on the left. And, you know, there's so much more 3-dimensional in the Steinberg impression than they are in the other impression, which looks more like an outline. If you can see what I'm talking about. Again, that 3-dimensionality really stands out in the Steinberg impression versus the impression down below.
Yeah, that's really helpful. That's super, super clear there, I think, the differences.
But having said that, Holly, you know, Susan is absolutely right. Leo Steinberg's impression is really stellar and very difficult, very, very difficult to find an impression like that on the market. And if you did find one, it would be very, very expensive, you know, so.
Yes. Yeah. So you're training us to look for the very best, but we'll address pretty soon. What do you do if you don't have a budget for the top print? So we'll get there. One other important thing to think about too is, as I mentioned before, sort of the life of the print after it left the printing press. And so that's what we call sort of condition. So not only was it a good impression, but then has it been well taken care of over time? And so this print is in the Steinberg exhibition, and normally a museum probably wouldn't put this one on display because it has some condition problems and might even have some impression quality problems, but it makes a point related to Steinberg scholarship. This is probably, as many of you could quickly see, this is a reproduction of Michelangelo's Last Judgment fresco in the Vatican in the Sistine Chapel. And it's interesting then that the figure of the Virgin Mary is missing here because it is made by a British artist who's appealing to a British audience who doesn't consider Mary to be an intercessor with Christ in the Anglican tradition there. But anyway, I put this in. Most museums probably wouldn't put this one on display. Tell me all the condition problems that you see here, please, Carolyn and Susan.
Big chunk out of the top. Big bite. Somebody took a real big bite.
But you see, this is still, even though it's not a fine impression, and it's an English artist. It's not even an English artist after Michelangelo. It's an English artist working after a very famous Martino Rota after Michelangelo. So is he 18th century? I don't even know offhand, Holly.
Probably, Susan.
But it looks at working after a 16th century artist, working after a 15th century work of art. But for Leo, there was that piece of iconography, Holly, would have been so important. And Leo would have glanced at something like this and said, wow, that's so interesting. So it was very valuable to him.
And it's really appropriate that it should be in the exhibition as well, because it really speaks to what Leo was doing.
The paper is discolored. It looks like it's stained, quite stained at the right edge. It looks as if it's been folded down the center. With old master prints, they often are not in very good condition. And you really do have to evaluate, can they be, if they're sunstruck, if they've been burnt by the sun, that is a very hard thing to treat. If they have foxing, a good paper conservator can treat that. You should refrain from doing any home repairs yourself. That is really a terrible mistake. You don't know what will happen to an adhesive, or you might want to touch in a little area. You don't know how the ink will change over time. Conservators are amazing people. They are art historians, and they are artisans, and they are chemists, and it is an art form. Really good conservation is they're gods as far as I'm concerned, and what they can do to preserve great works of art. But something like this, you buy this because it's interesting to you. You don't buy this as a work of art per se.
Or as a fine print. And I mean, if you saw this and you were taken with the image and it was $25 or $50, that would be fine. But in my opinion, it shouldn't be priced at $500 or $200.
And Leo probably paid £1 sterling for it, would be my guess.
A couple dollars.
There's a question here on foxing. Could you explain what that is?
When mold, and if a print is kept in an album or even in mats or stored anywhere or framed, if it gets damp, a little bit of mold can start to grow in it. And that is something that really can be treated very successfully by modern conservators. Back in the day, that people used to just kind of apply bleach, which was a huge mistake.
And
wind up with white spots.
Sorry, just to say foxing, what it looks like are brown spots.
Reddish brown.
Yeah,
reddish brown.
Right, reddish brown, right, of varying sizes. You know, they can be tiny, it can be larger spots, it can virtually cover an entire print.
Yeah. But something that can look like foxing and isn't, and it cannot really be treated successfully, typically, is something called an iron inclusion. And that means that in the paper pulp, Holly showed you the frames they use for making laid paper. Sometimes the mash of rags or whatever was used to make that particular paper, later they use cotton and even later wood pulp. Sometimes little slivers of iron, of metal, get into the paper. And over time, they actually rust, and that rust eats right through the paper. And the only thing a conservator can do really is to cut it out and plug it with a little bit of paper fiber, basically, to fill that spot. You know, if it's in the middle of a virgin's face, in the middle of a Dürer, it's absolutely a catastrophe. If it's in a little corner, say at the bottom of this print, you wouldn't put money into conserving this print, but on a nicer print, if there were a little spot at the bottom in a blank area, then a good conservator could just, even sometimes they just put paper pulp over it to mask it, because seeing a big red blub in the middle of a black and white print is disturbing. Most people don't like to see that.
Okay, well, thank you for those thoughts on condition. We are gonna just talk a little bit more about this idea of the big name artist versus, so for example, on the right here, we have another print by Dürer that's for sale at the print fair now. And then we have this work by an artist who we only know by his monogram, which is hidden here almost on this MW right down here. So how, not giving an actual dollar amount, but how would you value these relative to each other and why?
The one on the left, in a certain way, is hard to value. It's fantastic. This is unlike Dürer. This was a cruder hand. This was meant to be a broadside. It was meant to be moralizing. And we're very interested in prints that show women in this light as dominating or running the show. In the 16th century, this clearly had a moralizing aspect to it. It's incredibly rare. Carolyn, I don't think we ever saw another impression of this, did we?
Mm-mm, mm-mm.
Carolyn and I appraised this collection, as I already told you that when it was brought into the collection. It's super, super, super rare, and it's great subject matter. And frankly, if we had it in stock, we would assess how many institutions we thought would feel they just absolutely needed it. And then we would look at other prices of other very rare 16th century woodcuts to come to a price that we felt was fair. But it's a valuable print.
And you couldn't actually have chosen a more opposite object, Holly, than this very, 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 very late Dürer woodcut. As Susan said, these were printed in thousands of impressions. And it really gets back again to what was the artist's intention. Mm-hmm. And the artist's intention wasn't that his woodcut would look like this. I mean, this is so late that the block is degraded to the point where you can't really read it very successfully. Mm-hmm. And so really it's two opposites completely. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's debatable. I think you really have to think as a collector, do you really want to own something by a famous artist if it really isn't what the artist intended it to look like when he made it? Where is the value in that? It's not in the name. It's not in the name. I mean, if you say, okay, I own a Dürer, well, what does it actually look like? Mm-hmm. So you have to be careful.
And I think I should have explained a little bit more about what this print is on the left. If we read the title of it, Women Snaring Men, Women Bird Catching for Husbands, we have women on the right here who are behind sort of a blind. They've created some structure covered with leaves to disguise themselves, and then they are catching men in this trap. So it is a topic, or was humorous at the time. I think it appeals to many people now, are thinking about sort of gender relations and these really sort of funny subject matter. So in terms of kind of the sacred versus the profane, I think one appeals perhaps more to a modern audience, but largely in terms of value we're talking about, it has to do with impression quality as well. So I would imagine I think the point here too is when they were first made, the one on the left would have been very cheap and the original Dürer on the right would have been much more expensive. But hundreds of years later and thousands of impressions later, it's a very different story. Okay, let's, I did ask Carolyn and Susan to take a look at the West Coast Print Fair website and come up with some examples of works that sort of fall generally within the old master category or using kind of old master print techniques, using intaglio prints that they thought were on the they thought were good value and that were on the lower end. So just to say these can be kind of entry market types of works. So these were the two that we came up with. So could you talk to us about the Goya and the Burrell, please?
Carolyn, do you want to, shall I?
Go ahead.
Goya made about 300 prints over the course of his career, and I'm sure you've all heard of him, one of the greatest Spanish painters, but also just really one of the most inventive artists to have ever lived throughout Europe. He published several sets of prints. The Caprichos was printed during his lifetime, but the Proverbios, which this comes from, was not printed during his lifetime. To buy a proof is to buy a very, very rare and very, very expensive object. In the 19th century, the plates were reprinted. were printed in, full editions. And this one was printed, was it the Gazette des Beaux-Arts? I'm sorry, I can't quite see it.
Yeah, it was printed in 1877. It was one of 4 plates that were separated from the original group of the Proverbios, and
Which
therefore
were also never published during his lifetime.
It was posthumous. So, yeah.
It shows a different sensibility than Goya's. He actually typically cleanly wiped his plates, and this shows the 19th century predilection for leaving lots of nice ink on the plate. But it's a fantastic image. Just the wonderful figures of the Moors are just so beautifully drawn, and the elephant is so charming. And it's a fairly large print. I can't tell you exactly offhand, but more than, I'd say, 2 sheets of typing paper.
Probably about
It's
12 by
sizable.
18.
And it looks like it's intact. It should have margins, but even without, I think at $1,800, we're judging these prints from images on the internet, so it's tricky. If this thing is blinding bright white in person, then it's been overcleaned. But if it isn't, then it's a perfectly wonderful thing. Paul Burrell on the right, I've actually never heard of him, but this is one thing that makes prints really wonderful. They're beautiful, charming prints made by artists who are not famous or not known as painters, like Rembrandt and Goya. And it looks like a lovely impression. I'd say it looks like it's an original condition. Probably it came from a group of, from the artist's estate, I would say. It has kind of a proofy feeling to it. And for $400, if you like the draftsmanship and if you're interested in investigating who Paul Burrell was, it's kind of a fun mystery print. And it looks like a beautiful impression in very nice condition.
And I would say in this particular case, the Goya, because this series wasn't published during his lifetime, that's reflected in the price, because the 2 series that were published during Goya's lifetime were the Capriccios and the bullfighting series, the Tauromachia. And because they were published during his lifetime, now fine lifetime impressions from both of those series are over $5,000, somewhere between $5,000 and $10,000 each. Whereas in the case of the Proverbios, because they weren't published during his lifetime, they are considerably less expensive. This one is $1,800. Others from the series might be $3,000 or $3,500. And the other great series that wasn't published during his lifetime are the Miseries of War, and a really monumentally important series of prints. And the way you most commonly see them are in the first edition, posthumous edition, and subsequent editions as well, many editions. But those can be $1,800 to $2,400, $2,500, $2,800. Proofs from those, however, are $80,000 to $150,000.
So there's a question here about what Susan meant by proofy on the right, but could you just explain in general what you mean by proofs?
Well, it's when the artist is working on the matrix, whatever medium it is, often they might sort of put their fingers into the ink and move it around a little bit if they want to show a little more shadow under a tree, or they manipulate it. It has the real feel of something that's very handmade.
Like
so
the inky plate edges, if you go around the edge of the plate, the ink looks like it's caught in the upper left and the upper and the lower right. And it has some pale gray at the very bottom within the plate, which is like plate tone, a little thin film of ink has been left on the plate.
It can be a little sloppy because the artist is playing around with it, and we like to feel that connection with the artist's creative process. Whereas the impression on the left of the Goya, that is a very professional printing. The Gazette des Beaux-Arts would have used I think it's Lyotard who publishes that, who prints that for them, a really fine printing firm. But these were super professional printers, and every impression in that run would look pretty much exactly the same.
Yeah.
Whereas my guess that this Burrell study of trees would there's probably not that many printed, but they may well look each a little bit different. And, most of us find that individualization, prints are multiples, but there's a leaning towards things that are individualized. We just like to see the artist's hand.
That's great. Well, we've got lots of questions coming in here. I'm going to kind of group them and save them towards the end. So if you're typing in questions, please keep going, but I'm going to get us a little bit further along. So a couple of the, one point we just wanted to hit too, and it's been brought up a little bit, how can you start learning about prints if you think this is great? I want to find out more about Paul Burrell, or I want to follow up on my favorite artist and potentially purchase a print. So one way, which has already been mentioned, which we welcome you to do as soon as it is safe, is to come to our print study room and look at the impressions that we have in our collection at the Blanton. You can do this at whatever your local print room is. Most museums have a print room where you can ask to see their versions of or their impressions by certain artists. And that's certainly part of our public mission that we enjoy doing. Another way is to go and visit exhibitions. At the Blanton, we have a paper vault where we have rotating exhibitions of our works on paper. Another is to talk to your local curator. Reach out to me or the local curator of prints and drawings at your local museum. And just this week, I've gotten a couple of requests that I've responded to via email to give feedback on what a print process might be, for example. Something else, these are two books, sort of very basic books that we also highly recommend. The one on the left has a bit more to do. It talks about printmaking, but also how and where to buy prints. The work on the right is sort of the canonical basic text on the history and techniques of printmaking. It helps you recognize them and get your eye in a bit for what they should look like. And then we can move to the sort of the question of where should you go to buy prints? I was just had navigated you to that West Coast Print Fair website. Locally here in Central Texas, the Mcnair Print Fair, there's an image here from 2019 when we were able to gather there. And the Mcnair Print Fair is great in that it has a range of contemporary printmakers and old master print dealers. I like this slide here at the bottom because this Charles White print is one that we have in our collection. So this would be certainly come and take a look at the Blanton's version, and then you could come and take a look at the one, you look at the one that's for sale there and do some comparison. So Carolyn and Susan, could you briefly talk to us, because we're getting close to our time here, about the pros and cons of the different ways you can buy prints, auction versus from a dealer versus from a website, sight unseen?
We are great believers that you really should see the print in person. During COVID, that may take the form of asking dealers to send you something on approval. Some museums will allow their patrons to have things sent on approval to their print room. Not every museum is permitted to do that. There are liability issues, so that can be a whole complicated thing. But if you talk to a dealer, you probably will be able to work out something with them so that you can see the print in person. Dolan Maxwell, someone I didn't want to distract myself again by reading the questions, but someone asked, said something about like go to a reputable dealer. Well, for example, Dolan Maxwell is a wonderful dealership. They've been around for, I'm thinking, well, gosh, I remember Peter, who's no longer with us, Peter Maxwell, and his wife, Margot Dolan, founded it, I think, in the 1980s. It is now run by Ron Rumford, who's also himself a very fine artist. They show terrific artists. They're very strong on Atelier 17, but they do quite a bit of contemporary as well. They're very knowledgeable. You can, I think there's very little you can ask them that they couldn't answer for you. They're not all master print dealers. All masters are simply more complicated. But talk to dealers and get get the feeling about if they're being straight with you. And you can ask them, how does this rank? Is this an A, B, C, D, how do you rank the impression? And it's not rude to say, I'm starting out, can you explain to me why you have priced it thus? And, a good dealer should be willing to discuss that with you.
And I would say that the dealer experience is very different from trying to buy something at auction, because at auction, the auction house is working for the seller. They're representing the seller, and they have usually a great deal of material to go through and to describe. And it's really very much a buyer beware situation. I would say buying at auction is one of the most difficult things to do until you get some experience in the field in which you are interested in. Because really, if you try to buy at auction, you're pretty much on your own.
But what you can do, if you're interested in something at auction, if they describe it as early and fine, and you think, well, this is something that I may want to pursue, and that sale in non-pandemic times is taking place in New York, you can make an appointment and go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and look at their impression, or sometimes, because it's such a rich collection, impressions. If you're trying to buy a Rembrandt, you might want to make an appointment at the Morgan Library, go look at their impressions, and then go back and look at the one at auction again.
And also, there's a lot to be learned online. I mean, so many institutions, you can, just by taking the artist's name and the title of the print and saying etching and putting in your browser, you'll come up with numerous collections often that have an impression of that particular print. You can then go to that website and look at that, make comparisons online. Even if you can't go in person, often that kind of a search will take you to dealer websites as well. So I agree with Susan. I think, you have to go out and try to do some research before you leap into going after something at auction.
That's a great point. And I just want to point a couple other resources. The London Original Print Fair is also up. The IFPDA, which is based in stateside, also has some great resources. And these are, again, typically in-person print fairs, which are great fun because you walk around and you just are sort of overwhelmed by all the options, but it's great too to have these online now. So I want to point you to a couple more of these resources. And then
if you can go in person, if you're interested in prints and you can go in person once the pandemic is under control, the IFPDA fair and the London Original Print Fair are just fantastic because there's so many people. And sometimes even with old masters, you can see several impressions of the same print. And it's just really fun to be able to make those comparisons.
Absolutely, yeah. And then you can see the different prices and the different qualities and start to train your eye.
And be meeting the dealers in person and asking, whatever questions you feel you need to ask.
And I would say in my personal print experience, people that are old master print dealers are generally very happy to help educate you and train your eye and talk to you. And I've learned a lot, certainly by talking with you two, and it's, it can be intimidating the first time you walk in, but you just start asking questions and, they're happy to educate you because then that makes another, customer who understands and is interested in following things. So it's in their interest to talk with you too. So don't be shy, go in and ask your questions. And it really is sort of a fun exploratory journey.
Do you remember most dealers are doing it, Holly, because they really love what they're selling.
That's true.
I love prints. I love I'm an antiquarian at heart. I love old master prints. So nothing makes me happier than talking about them.
Absolutely. No, I think it's a shared love. And so when you can talk about it and then, and I've certainly learned a lot. Yes, it's lovely to find somebody else that shares that interest. And then, I'm sort of Well, I'd say your career has taken you to many museums all over the world and looked at many, many, many impressions. That's sort of, you have this mental image bank that it takes years to develop. So getting to draw on that through conversation and asking, can you point this out, help me understand this? It's really a wealth of information that dealers can have. I just wanted to finish with one image here of Leo Steinberg's notebooks. We had a question here about the prices that Leo paid and what things cost now. You can see here, these are from 1961, the prices he's paying: $2, $6, $5, $14. And there were just a question about 2021 prices. And so, Carolyn and Susan, I wonder whether you could just comment about the prices that Leo paid and the prices that are out there now, and whether is it just a matter of sort of inflation, or has there been a change in the market?
Taste changes. 17th century Dutch print. I actually can't read it on my screen, Holly. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no,
but for example, Van Ostade, in the 1980s, people would pay anything for them, absolutely anything for them. And the Mannerist artists, besides Gaucius, people weren't that interested in. Now, Van Ostade is not as sought after, and people love Mannerist prints, and they bring far higher prices. So there's a fashion and taste that gets reflected, but also prints are just like everything else. They're a luxury. When they're fine, they're a luxury item, and there's been great inflation. It used to be a middle class pastime, and it's less so now. As you'll see, even a print that's $400 is not nothing. But in the print world, that's very inexpensive and a great bargain for a legitimate print, not for something meaningless. So I'm sorry, I'm not sure if that answered the question.
Well, just has there been a general rise in the prices of prints over time? Have they become a medium that's more collected than when Leo was collecting?
Yes. And there are now billionaires who collect prints. So at the very, very top, prints have become, when Carolyn and I started, we would never have dreamt that we would sell prints for over $1 million. And now that happens. So we've seen in our 40 plus years of dealing, we've seen a huge increase in value.
But I will say what still makes print collecting so wonderful is, yes, there are those heights, but there's still the wonderful $400 print. So not to be intimidated by the prices, because as Susan said, if you can make it to the fine print fair in New York, it's such a fabulous experience, because you'll see such an enormously broad range of prints and prices and different subject matter, and you'll just see that it's a field that's really wide open to collectors still.
That's true. So let me we'll end my sort of slide presentation here with our email addresses. Carolyn and Susan have very kindly agreed to let me share those with you, so that if you have questions about a print that you've come across, or want to follow up with them on something that they said tonight, you are welcome to email them. I'm seeing lots of questions still in the chat that I wish I could get to, but I'm also going to leave my email address there and say, please email me. I would be happy to address any specific questions that you have. There are some interesting questions here about, can you reprint an old woodblock? You could if you came across one. There's nothing to stop you from it, but I don't think, as long as you're not trying to misrepresent it, if it belongs to you, it belongs to you. There's a question about the number of prints in a print run. There's some great resources that talk about, Anthony Griffith's book can tell you more about the numbers of possible prints, but they're sort of broad guesses of thousands, or less per state probably. But these are the things that really nitty-gritty print scholars get into the weeds about. So we're going to need to wrap it up there. And I just want to Thank you all for joining us, and give a few reminders about some upcoming programs at the Blanton. But really, thank you so much, Carolyn and Susan. This just is the tip of the iceberg. This is a lifetime pursuit of knowledge, and we're so grateful for what you shared with us. But let me just remind us about some upcoming things. Our next curated conversation will be on Tuesday, March 23rd. It's titled Creativity and Aging. For details or to watch past curated conversations, go to blantonmuseum.org/museum from home. And I love that. Gray is good. Okay. And then finally, if you'd like to show your support, you can become a member, or perfect for the Valentine's Day that's upcoming, give the sweet treat of membership at blantonmuseum.org/membership. And finally, if you just want to always be in the know about programs like this and other news, sign up for our newsletter at blantonmuseum.org/subscribe. Thanks again, and we hope to see you next month. Goodbye.
Bye.